continue with the previous discussion. Now let's see another way of expressing exchange rate. Now we discuss about the direct quotation, we discuss about the indirect quotation. Among them again we discuss about the bid and ask rates, right? Now remember, so those direct and indirect quotation, we normally take some widely traded currencies, right? Like US dollar, UK pound, Japanese yen, etc. But there are some occasions, right? The traders can use some sort of non-dollar or widely not traded currencies. අපි සමහර ගොඩාක් වෙලාට exchange rate එක කතා කරද්දී US dollar කියන එක පොදු සාධකයක් වෙනවා. හැබැයි there are so many inactively traded currencies also there, like Sri Lankan rupee, right? If you want to express the exchange rate based on that type of inactively traded currencies, we normally use the exchange rate called cross exchange rate. And අපි use කරනවා exchange rate එක cross exchange rate කියලා. Okay. Now let's see what is this exchange rate. Now you can see examples are given, right? Now here what is the exchange rate given? It as per US dollar how many rupees? That is 334.84. And here you are getting another exchange rate that is for US dollar, per US dollar and pound. That means per US dollar how much of pound. Now based on this, US dollar is equal to rupee 334 and here US dollar is equal to pound 0.692. Right? Now you have two different exchange rates. Okay. Now if you want to express the exchange rate between Sri Lankan rupee with the UK pound, right? Now here we cannot see the direct one, but we are having different exchange rate in terms of dollar and rupee and in terms of dollar and pound. But if you want to calculate the exchange rate between UK pound and Sri Lankan rupee, now we can do the cross of these two exchange rates. May exchange rate දෙක අපි cross කරනවා. That is why it is calling as a cross exchange rate. Okay. So normally we are using this dollar terms of exchange rate while the dollar is a widely traded currency, right? While using that sort of widely traded exchange rates, we can also calculate inactively traded currencies exchange rate, right? Now, pound is not inactively traded, but for an example, we consider it as that, right? Now, let's see how we calculate the cross exchange rate. Okay. Now, based on the previous example, we can identify that US dollar to Sri Lankan rupee, US dollar to pound. By crossing these two exchange rate, US dollar to Sri Lankan rupee, US dollar to pound, we can calculate per pound how much of rupee we need to pay. So how can we do it? We can divide US dollar to rupee exchange rate into US dollar to pound. Then this US dollar getting vanish or getting set off, and you will get the exchange rate for per pound how much of Sri Lankan rupee. So that is a way we can calculate exchange rate in between pound and Sri Lankan rupee while using the exchange rate of dollar to rupees and dollar to pound. Okay, so that is what we call cross exchange rate. Right? Normally we are using this cross exchange rate to calculate the exchange rates between inactively traded currency while utilizing actively traded exchange rates. Right? I believe that you understand what is this cross exchange rate clearly. Okay? Right. Now, as far as we discuss about the way of expressing exchange rate, අපි මෙච්චර වෙලා කතා කරේ කොහොමද මේ exchange rate එක ඉදිරිපත් කරන්න කියලා. Now we are coming to the most important aspect in our international finance subject. How a particular country decide their exchange rates. That means how Sri Lankan rupee decide how much of rupees we need to pay for a US dollar. Or how Sri Lanka decide how much of Sri Lankan rupee need to be paid for a UK pound. That is what we call determination of foreign exchange rate. Right? So now we are going to understand about how we are going to identify the way of determining foreign exchange rate. Now remember, exchange rate determining as usual the way we decide the price of the particular product. දැන් අපි භාණ්ඩයක මිල තීරණය කරන්නේ කොහොමද කියලා ඔයගොල්ලෝ දන්නවනේ. Right? Similar concept applied here. Now instead of goods and services, here we have another currency. Right? දැන් අපි භාණ්ඩයක මිල තීරණය කරන්නේ භාණ්ඩේ හෝ සේවාවකට තියෙන ඉල්ලුම හා සැපයුම මතනේ. ඒතර මෙතන exchange rate එක තීරණය කරන්නේ යම්කිසි currency එකකට තියෙන ඉල්ලුම හා සැපයුම මත. So what we so called as a currency here is we are considering about demand for a foreign currency. That means demand for a US dollar and supply for a US dollar. While looking at this demand and supply of a particular foreign currency, we decide or country decide their exchange rate between domestic currency and that particular foreign currency. So the exchange rates are determined based on demand for a foreign currency and supply for a foreign currency. Okay, so that is the basic concept behind the determinants of foreign exchange rates. Right. Now we know how exchange rates are determined. That means based on the demand and based on the supply of foreign currency. Now, let's look at the foreign currency demand. On what occasion the country demand foreign currencies? Right? Now, normally we know, this is a very simple explanation. We know that we want to demand foreign currencies when we are importing goods and services. Right? When we are importing goods and services. අපි පිට රටකින් භාණ්ඩ ආනයනය කරනකොට අපිට ශ්‍රී ලංකන් රුපිය වලින් ගෙවන්න බෑ. We have to pay it in the foreign currency. Therefore, we have to demand the foreign currency in order to pay for our imports of goods and services. On the other way around, if we are investing some foreign denominated assets, likewise USA bonds, USA treasury bills, right? USA assets, right? USA share markets, right? We cannot invest Sri Lankan rupee. We have to invest in terms of US dollar. So in that case also, we need to demand foreign currency, right? Now again, for an example, if you are traveling to foreign country, අපි පිට රටක සංචාරයකට යනවා නම්, right? We cannot spend our rupees in US market, right? Then you need to have a dollar in your hand in order to spend in US markets, right? Therefore, again, you are demanding foreign currency. Okay? So these are the occasions where a particular country or individuals having demand for foreign currency. Now remember, when you are demanding foreign currency, you have to supply domestic currency. Dollars demand කරන්න නම් ඔයාලට රුපිය වලින් ගෙවන්න ඕනේ. Right? Likewise, what we explained in the previously, when we are ready to buy US dollar, we have to pay it in terms of Sri Lankan rupee and buy US dollar. Right? Therefore, demand for foreign currency is exactly equal to supply of domestic currency. Right? I believe you understand that two scenarios. Right? What we so-called demand for foreign currency mean, we always supply the domestic currency. Okay? So likewise in a demand curve, අපි දන්න ඔයගොල්ලෝ දන්නවා demand theory එකට අනුව, for a demand curve, there is a downward sloping curve, or we said there is a negative relationship in a quantity demand and price of the good. Likewise, in a foreign currency, also, we are having the negative relationship with exchange rates and quantity demand. Right? Now, here the exchange rate you have. Right? There is exchange rate. Now, we are having the downward sloping. Now, the reason for having this downward sloping is, right, assuming that the exchange rate getting increased. Right? Now, for an example, we have exchange rate call. Now, assume example, we have exchange rate call rupees 100 for an example, right? Per dollar. Right? Rupees 100. That means per dollar, we valued it as 100 rupee. Now, this exchange rate change due to some reasons. We will discuss that reason later. Right? From 100 rupees to 110 rupees. Then on exchange rate වෙනස් වෙනවා රුපියල් 100 ඉඳලා 110ට per dollar. Right? If exchange rate increase like this, what will happen? Normally we know when the prices are increasing, the demand for particular goods and services getting declining. Likewise, when the exchange rate increase, demand for import goods and services getting decline. Why? Earlier, we import the good by paying 100 rupees per dollar. But now we have to pay 110 rupees per dollar. Now the imported good price are getting expensive in terms of Sri Lankan rupee. Therefore, there is a low demand for imported goods and services. When there is a low demand for imported goods and services, there is a low demand for foreign currency. Why? Because we are demanding foreign currency when we are importing goods and services. When the imported goods and services getting low, there is a low demand for foreign currency. That is why we are always having negative relationship between exchange rates and quantity demand of foreign currency. Right? So that is a reason for having negative relationship. I hope that you understand the foreign currency demand. Right. Moving on with the supply of the foreign currency supply. On what sources the country receives foreign currency? රටකට කොහොමද foreign currency ලැබෙන්නේ? Now for an example, on what sources Sri Lanka receives US dollar? Definitely from our exports. Right? From our export, we receive Sri Lankan US dollar. Right? When foreign investors are investing Sri Lankan denominated assets, again we are receiving US dollar. When foreigners are traveling in Sri Lanka, nowadays there is a massive programs to attract tourists to Sri Lankan destination. Right? Likewise, when foreigners are coming to Sri Lanka, that means the dollar demand, dollar supply increases. Right? So these are the sources. Now, as the supply curve, right? Supply curve as the supply curve also likewise the supply curve, quantity of supply of dollar, quantity of supply, and here is the exchange rate. Okay, here is the exchange rate. We are having positive slope. We are having positive slope, supply of dollar. How this is become a positive supply curve or upward sloping supply curve? It is happening like this. Now we take the same example. Now for an example, earlier we are having exchange rate 100 rupees per dollar. Now exchange rate increases 110 rupees per dollar. Okay, now it increase. Now when the dollar price, Sri Lankan rupee prices increase, when the exchange rate increase, what we can see for a dollar price? Right? Now here again, if we write this one the other way around, here what we can see is, now dollar where's it? Dollar 0.01 per rupee. Isn't it? Now, earlier our exchange rate is per dollar 100 rupees. Okay, per dollar 100 rupees. Now, if you are converting into the indirect pay, that means per rupee, dollar is 0.01. Right? Now, when the exchange rate increased to 110 from 100, now this exchange rate getting declining. Right? The US dollar values now getting declining, right? 0. Maybe 0.0098 or something, right? You take the calculation. Now what you can see, now when the exchange rate increase, the dollar value in order to buy a rupee now getting decline. රුපියලකට ගෙවන්න ඕන ඩොලර්ස් ගන්න අඩු වෙනවා. As a result of that, when the dollars value are getting declining per unit of Sri Lankan rupee, there is a high demand for our exported goods and services. Why? Because our export goods and services are now getting cheaper for foreigners or our buyers, foreign buyers. Therefore, there is a high demand for exported goods and services. When demand for export goods and services increase, mean there is a supply of foreign currency. That is why there is a positive slope between or positive relationship between exchange rate and quantity supply of foreign currency. Okay, now you understand the reason for having negative relationship with exchange rate and foreign currency demand. There is a positive relationship between exchange rate and foreign currency supply. Okay, now you can see the determinants of exchange rate. Right? So exchange rate basically determined according to the demand and supply of foreign currency. Right? But when we are looking at the theoretical aspect of foreign exchange rate determinants, there are three scenarios for determining the foreign exchange rate. Right? There are three scenarios. We will discuss those parity conditions and balance of payment scenarios in our future sessions. Right? So there are three aspects. One aspect we call parity condition. Other one we call assessed approach. And next one we call balance of payment approach. Right? So there are several ways to determine the exchange rate. But the common scenario or most prominent mechanism for determining the exchange rate is demand and supply. Right? You need to remember that. So we will discuss those things in our future session in more detail. Right? For this moment, please remember demand foreign currency determinants are based on demand and supply of foreign currency. Right. So let's moving on. How the exchange rate getting equilibrium. That means how we decide what is the amount of rupee we need to pay for US dollar. Right? That is a very simple scenario that where demand and supply getting equal. That is the where exchange rate equilibrium occurs. Like price and quantity. Demand එක අනුවම තමයි. Right? When the demand and supply getting equal, you will decide, you will get the equilibrium foreign exchange rate. Now you can see here and graphically, right? So this is the demand for a foreign currency, right? This is the initial demand for a foreign currency. You can see in this one. And this is the initial supply of foreign currency. While combining with or equalizing demand and supply, you will get the exchange rate at a point A. Right? These are hypothetical figures. Right? At a point A, it will decide Sri Lankan rupee 180 is exactly equal to $1 of US. Right? So that is the equilibrium exchange rate. When the demand for US dollar equal to supply of US dollar, you will get the equilibrium exchange rate in between Sri Lankan rupee and US dollar. Now, assuming that as a result of the some other reasons, we will explain it later. As a result of some reason, there is a high demand for foreign currency. There's a high demand. Now, for an example, we want to import more goods from foreign market, right? Then import good demand increase mean there is an increase of demand for foreign currency. Now, the initial demand curve shift to the right-hand side. Now, you can see that initial point A shift into the new equilibrium point, that is point B. Now, that is the point of new equilibrium as a result of the changes in foreign currency demand, right? Or else we can see if there is a increase in the supply of foreign currency. Now, for an example, there may be a massive attractiveness to Sri Lankan destination by foreigners. Then that means tourist arrival to Sri Lanka increase. As a result of that, supply of US dollar increase. Then initial supply curve shift to the right hand side. Now our new equilibrium is equilibrium point C. Now you can see exchange rate now getting lower from 180 to 175. Right? Now this is the way exchange rates are determining, or exchange rates are getting equilibrium. Okay, so that is a simple explanation about how country decide what is the price of the foreign currency in terms of their domestic currency. Right? At a scenario A, Sri Lankan decide US dollar price equal to 180. At a scenario B, now Sri Lankan rupee getting exchange rate get increased, and now we have to pay 185 rupees in order to purchase $1 US. At a scenario C, the exchange rate getting declined. Now we need to pay 175 Sri Lankan rupee in order to buy $1 US. So likewise, you can see the shifting the demand and supply will result to change exchange rate, either increase or decrease. Right? Now, what we discuss is the shifting demand and supply. So you might be, now we explain this one, right? We explain how the things are changing, right? You can read the explanation. Now the thing is here, I just mentioned that demand curve shift to the right hand side. Demand curve shift to the right hand side, and supply curve shift to the right hand side. Right? Now, what are the reasons of that shifting, or what are the reasons of changing equilibrium exchange rate? Right? So that's the thing we need to know. Okay? So there are several reasons. I will explain one in detail, and then you can get your textbooks and find out how the equilibrium exchange rates are changed according to these different factors. Right? Now, for an example, let's look at the inflation rate. Right? Inflation rate. Now, remember, here we are using the specific term relative inflation rate. What do you mean by relative? Relative means we are comparing one inflation rate with another interest rate. So here, what we are relative mean, we are comparing inflation rate in Sri Lanka and inflation rate in USA. Right? That is what we call relative inflation rate. Okay, now assuming that inflation rate in Sri Lanka, we assuming that equal it is 5%. Right? And inflation rate in US, assuming that it is equal 1%. Right? When comparing to the USA inflation rate with Sri Lankan inflation rate, now we see that Sri Lankan inflation rates are relatively higher than USA inflation rate. When inflation rate is high mean one, our goods and services prices are relatively higher than USA goods and services. Example, similar product, right? Now, for an example, let's say rice. Right? For an example, right? Let's say rice. Because of having high inflation rate, rice price in Sri Lanka relatively higher than USA price. Isn't it? Right? Because inflation rate in Sri Lanka is high, mean compared to the USA goods and services prices, Sri Lankan prices are relatively high. Right? Then people are comparing whether we are consuming domestically produced goods or services, or we are going for imported goods and services. Now, what do you think? Which one is getting cheaper? Since inflation rate in Sri Lanka is relatively higher than USA, our domestically produced goods and services are high compared to our imported goods and services from USA. Then here what we can see is imported good price is lower than domestically produced good. Isn't it? Because of having high inflation, right? Then people are more willing to, then Sri Lankan people willing to import goods from USA, right? When people are willing to import goods from USA because of the low inflation rate in USA, there is a demand for US dollar, right? When there is a demand for US dollar, there is a tendency to increase exchange rate, right? There is a tendency to increase exchange rate, right? So that is why equilibrium exchange rate change. You will understand the reasons, right? When compared to the USA, if Sri Lankan inflation rate is high, Sri Lankan people are more willing to consume goods and services imported from USA. Why? Because USA product prices are cheaper than domestically produced prices. As a result of that, there is a demand for imported goods and services. When there is a demand for imported goods and services, there is a demand for US dollar or foreign currency. When there is a demand for US dollar or foreign currency, there is an increasing of exchange rate. Then equilibrium exchange rate change. Right? Then equilibrium exchange rate change. So that is the one factor affecting to the equilibrium exchange rate changing. Okay. Now you can understand. Then refer the textbook and find out how relative interest rate influence to the equilibrium exchange rate changes, how relative economic growth influence to the equilibrium exchange rate changes, how political and economic risks influence to the equilibrium exchange rate change, how government control or stable political situation or government intervention to the foreign exchange market influence to the equilibrium exchange rate changes, and finally the expectation of the investors going to influence the exchange rate changes. Okay, so these are the way you need to identify the changes of the equilibrium exchange rate. Okay, so please refer the textbook page number 54 to 57 and identify how these factors affect to the equilibrium exchange rate. How these relative interest rate or relative economic growth influence to shift in the demand of foreign supply or shift in the supply of shift in the demand for foreign currency or shift in the supply of foreign currency. Right. So this scenario also indicating you how these factors influencing to the exchange rate changes, right? So it's the same thing I explain it here. Make among explain kara isalla, right? The scenario I explained previously using inflation of USA and inflation of Sri Lanka. Okay, refer this one. And you can also see the interest rate. Right. Now let's quickly look at the exchange rate changes calculation as what we discussed as a bid and ask spread. Right. Now you might be seeing that there are so many discussion on Sri Lankan rupee depreciation, Sri Lankan rupee appreciation. Appreciation are not, we don't hear for a considerable time period, but continuously we heard that Sri Lanka getting depreciate. Api Sinhalen kiyana rupiyala avapramaණය වෙනවා. එහෙම නැත්නම් පොදු භාෂාවෙන් කියන රුපියල බාල්දු වෙනවා. Right? Appreciation or depreciation. So there is a way of calculating appreciation or depreciation. You can get the value for different ways, right? The old rupee value minus new rupee value divided by new rupee value of dollar. Right? Sometimes textbook take it as a new rupee value minus old rupee value of and new rupee value of dollar. So you will get the calculation of appreciation or depreciation. Okay. Now remember, whatever we are taking as appreciation or depreciation. Now for an example, if Sri Lankan rupee getting depreciate mean, if Sri Lankan rupee getting depreciate against US dollar mean, US dollar getting appreciate against Sri Lanka. It is some sort of two side in a one coin, right? When we say that Sri Lankan rupee getting depreciate against US dollar, in other way around again we can say US dollar getting appreciate against Sri Lankan rupee, right? Now this is a formula you can calculate the appreciation and depreciation, right? You have some example also here. Okay, so exchange rate earlier that old one is 0.93, new one is 1.09. Then you can calculate the appreciation or depreciation of the euro by taking new value minus old value divided by old value. You will get the positive sign like 17.2. Say now it is says that euro is said to have appreciate. Why? We are having positive value here. If you are getting positive value, that means euro is appreciate against US dollar by 17.2%. Okay, that is the appreciation. And we can take it other way around, right? Now we are taking it euro now. Now we are here, we are considering euro, right? Whether euro is getting appreciate or depreciate. When we are looking at it, euro getting appreciate again US dollar. Okay. Now, if you are considering about the US dollar, in terms of US dollar, now US dollar getting depreciate, right? There is some changes in the calculation, right? Because of having this decimal points of calculating this, right? So there is a decimal point issue. Therefore, you are getting, when euro getting appreciate, remember that dollar getting depreciate. Right? So that is the way we are calculating appreciation and depreciation of foreign currency or domestic currency. We can look at the both way, right? Appreciation of domestic currency means depreciation of the foreign currency. Depreciation of the domestic currency means appreciation of the foreign currency. Okay, so that's the way we need to calculate. Right. So now let's look at last part of our session. Now, whatever we so far discussed about how exchange rates are expressing and how we are calculating this exchange rate and what factors causing us to change the exchange rate, right? And we finally calculate how to determine whether currency getting appreciate or depreciate against another currency. So these are the things we discussed so far. So our last part, we are discussing about the appreciation of the exchange rate or anticipation of the exchange rate, how it will impact to the investment decision of a person, right? How it impact to the investment decision of the person.